the outset, it may seem like an eternity before these young trees begin to look like a forest. But you'll be surprised at how quickly the years slip by and your trees grow from this to this to this. A good beginning is half the work, and nowhere is this old saying more true than in establishing a forest plantation. Forestry is a long-term investment, and mistakes made at the outset can cost a lot of money later on. So it's vital that you get it right from the start. This programme explores the areas you should consider and the decisions you must make before you plant a single tree.
The design and layout of a plantation is ultimate to the success of the plantation. And it's important when you see a farm or see a number of fields that are coming into forestry to try and make sure that, if the land is suitable for growing a different range of species, to try and introduce, biodiversity. Don't just plant the same species just because it's easy, As regards to the actual layout of the operation, like say ground preparation, drainage, channels, those sort of things, it's important to make sure that your drains aren't running into watercourses, that you're putting in things like silt traps. And also on a particular site, there'll be things of interest on that site which you won't want damaged by large heavy forestry machinery. So it's important to sort of earmark those and take them off and make sure you don't cause damage. So good planning, good preparation is essential for making sure that all the things you want to have on your farm and on your new forest that takes place right the first time.
Planning the layout of the site is probably the most important thing that you're going to do early on in the life of the plantation. And as it happens, it's also something that's not going to cost you anything. What you need to do is visualise, how am I going to get around this site with the quad bike or with the tractor, maybe in 2 years' time to bring in water for spraying, or maybe in 15 years' time with a small machine for harvesting. You can see that what's been done here is that the ripping has been carried out at right angles to the central trackway, so that if a machine needs access to the lines, it's just a case of turn down each line, go down to the headland at the end and come back up the central access pathway between them. What's also nice here is that it hasn't been ripped evenly right to the edge of the road, so over time what you'll see is a nice kind of scalloped effect. In nature, straight lines don't work so well, and curved or scalloped edges look much nicer and more natural.
Before any work begins, you should carefully plan the layout of your site. Now is the time to think about access for machinery, management tracks that you can develop into forest roads later on, and of course the impact of your trees on the landscape as they mature. At this stage, it's a good idea to talk to your Teagasc forestry advisor about all of these areas.
The most important thing to consider now would be access. In the short term, to actually get plants in, get sprayers in and out, machinery, and then in the long term then to actually get the timber out of the plantation.
The need for good access is essential for a successful plantation. Although it's easy to move around a newly planted site, within a few years the rapid growth of the trees will hinder movement. Unless you have planned ahead with this in mind, extraction of thinnings and mature trees from the site is going to be difficult and expensive. On larger sites, there should be a central roadway from which as much of the site is accessible as possible. Sites that aren't big enough to justify their own road system should have a bellmouth entrance with enough off-road loading space to make extraction and haulage easier during thinning and harvesting. Access is one of the areas that the Forest Service will consider before granting approval to plant.
What I would say is that we could probably put an access track left unplanted on the boundary of Plot 2, which will connect your agricultural fields up here, which allow you to access this when you're actually managing the old plantation that you have over here. Yeah. And also it means, well, in the management of your forest plantation, if you have a nice access track all the way down the bottom, it means you can drive your ATVs, your tractors, you can carry out fertilising and sort of maintenance and weed control a lot easier. Yeah. And also it allows you to carry out inspections as the plantation is growing sort of old over the next sort of 4 to 5 years. So that's important that we have access in there.
Even during the early years of the site, a good network of management paths and roadways is invaluable. Plants for filling in can be quickly distributed and water tanks can be efficiently transported around the site when spraying works are being carried out. But it's not just about making the work easier. Failure to provide access at the beginning may eventually mean having to fell lines of trees in order to build a road for first thinning. This felling may increase the risk of wind throw by creating an unstable gap or opening in the crop. Access tracks should be laid out in conjunction with drains, avoiding crossover where possible. Where drains must cross pathways, you will need to build culverts. Sustainable forest management stresses the vital environmental and social functions that must go hand in hand with commercial timber production. Just because a plantation is commercial doesn't mean that it can't enhance the landscape and wildlife in the area. 15% of your site must be treated with particular regard to biodiversity. These areas may include roads, ride lines, aquatic zones, open spaces, fire breaks, archaeology exclusion zones and retained habitats. If you're planting conifers, try to include some different species planted irregularly around the edge. Over time, this will soften the appearance of your plantation, as well as improving species diversity for wildlife.
A good quality fence is so important. The site has to be stockproof in order to get your grant in the first place. But there's no point spending a lot of money on good quality plants and planting and site design if you're taking the risk that cattle or sheep are going to get in and damage your trees.
If your site is adjacent to farmland, physical damage by trespassing livestock can be a real headache. In the early years, if cattle, sheep, rabbits, hares and deer are not excluded from your site, they will eat trees and kill them or leave them deformed. In later years, trespassing cattle and sheep can cause damage to the drainage system and also root damage, which is generally irreversible. It's important to fence the area before you begin planting. The types of fencing you need will depend on the type of stock outside your plantation boundaries. All wire must conform to ISO standards. The ideal fencing for cattle consists of 3 strands of 3-inch barbed wire on pressure-treated stakes 4 metres apart. A sheep fence is sheep netting with 2 strands of barbed wire on top. Electric fencing on its own is not acceptable. For rabbits, you need 4-foot 1-inch mesh wire, and you should bury the bottom of the wire 1 foot deep on the outside of the fence. Where you need to exclude stock as well as rabbits, you can strengthen this fence by using 2 strands of barbed wire above the mesh and at least 1 strand of plain wire through the middle. If there's a large deer population in your area, deer fencing might be necessary, although it's expensive. Remember to provide stiles and gates so that you can access the site easily without damaging the fence.
Farmers often like to see sites completely cleared of scrub, but it's not always necessary to clear them completely, in that retained scrub and retained hedgerows can be vital in providing shelter for young trees and also add hugely to the biodiversity and to the wildlife value of any site.
Where considerable scrub has been removed, it's very important to control re-invading vegetation in the early years.
Okay, Noel, you see the scrub coming back up? Yes. The re-invading scrub there where we cleared it off last year. Yes. It'll be very important now this year coming to control that, to make sure that the trees actually get away before that scrub gets totally out of control.
Some scrub should be left in place to encourage biodiversity. Hedgerows, for instance, are part of our landscape and home to a variety of wildlife. These trees are benefiting from the shelter of the nearby hedgerows.
Drainage is one of the most vitally important considerations to take into account when you're planning the layout of the site on day one. Any drainage problems are only going to lead to water retention later on in the site, and this means that where you have high water table, you're not going to have rooting depth in the trees. If the trees can't root down deeply, they're going to fall over in wind and storm situations. And this is something that can be avoided by good planning and setting out your drainage properly on day one.
The drainage conditions on your site will determine what method of cultivation you use, but in all cases make sure to provide adequate cut-off drains and allow sufficient slope for water runoff. You must also construct silt traps on all outlet drains. These silt traps help to prevent silt running into streams and waterways. Water entering a silt trap stagnates and the silt is then able to settle before the water runs out. Large silt traps must be fenced off to avoid accidents. Remember, when you're putting drainage in place, you must follow the Forest Service water quality guidelines at all times. The most commonly used cultivation technique is mechanical mounding, and it's generally used on flat sites where drainage is a concern or where there's a high water table. Drains are opened by a tracked excavator, and the soil from these drains is used to create mounds into which the trees are planted. The drains can be opened at either 8 or 12 metre centres, depending on the depth of topsoil and the frequency of drains required. As well as improving drainage on your site, mounding produces a loosened planting medium which allows the roots to penetrate more easily. The elevation provided by the mound also separates the tree from competing vegetation. Weed control may not be necessary at all in the first year. Remember that all cultivation and drainage must be carried out in accordance with the Forest Service environmental guidelines. And make sure to plan the cultivation carefully so that you can access all areas of the site easily while you are planting. Where there is a pan or impermeable layer, ripping will be necessary. Ripping shatters the pan and loosens the soil. This allows trees to achieve greater rooting depth and be more stable as a result. Unlike trees planted on mounds, those planted in ripped ground do not have a head start over competing weeds and vegetation, so weed control will be needed before planting. On steep ground, it's important to rip and mound at an angle to the contour to slow down water being carried in rip channels and so reduce erosion on the site. Regular collector drains should be opened at 30 to 50 metre intervals to collect water from the rip channels. On good quality agricultural land that does not require drainage or subsoiling, mechanical planting machines may be used, and these have proved to be both cost-effective and very successful in terms of tree establishment. Care taken in cultivation makes the management of your site a lot easier in the long run. By taking care to cultivate in straight lines, travel, whether by tractor or by ATV, is made a lot easier. In areas of high visual amenity or where sites are facing a public road, you could cultivate at an angle so that your plantation is more attractive in the landscape.
The nutrient requirements of every site are going to vary with the site itself. On good quality agricultural land, you may not need to use any fertiliser at all, in that the farmer may have been putting out fertiliser on a regular basis. As you go into poorer quality land, you're going to need some inputs of fertilisers.
The exact nutrient requirements of the site will depend on the type of land you have and the type of tree you intend to plant. On marginal land like this, rock phosphate is usually applied broadcast. Always apply fertiliser carefully to young trees, so that you can be sure it's the trees and not the weeds that benefit. When you finish the job, take care to remove all bags from the site and dispose of them in an environmentally responsible manner. Remember also that fertiliser must be applied between April and August in accordance with Forest Service water quality guidelines. This ensures maximum uptake of the fertiliser while minimising environmental damage. Keep records and dates of all activities in the plantation. Good planning and preparation will eliminate headaches and pitfalls years down the line. It will save you money and improve the quality of the crop. It's at this stage too that you should plan for the unexpected. Excavate fire lines along boundaries where there are fire risks, and make sure that your plantation is insured against fire and public liability. If your forest has been damaged by fire, you may be entitled to a grant under the Reconstitution of Woodland scheme. This is a cost-based scheme which covers the replanting of the site. Good planning in forestry, as in any enterprise, pays dividends. When carried out correctly, the process of establishing and managing your forest is a hugely satisfying and rewarding one. A good start is the key to success in the years to come.